Months after the divorce, a CEO took his new girlfriend to a luxury dinner. But when he saw his ex-wife working to make a living, almost 8 months pregnant, he was furious and shocked. The humid, sultry air of New Orleans wrapped around the night, carrying the earthy scent of the Mississippi River and the vibrant city that pulsed along its banks. For Michael Reynolds, though, that aroma was just the backdrop to the smell of power and success. At 38, he had turned a modest family shipping business into an empire of river logistics, Reynolds Riverways, whose barges sliced through the muddy waters of the Mississippi like vital arteries for regional trade. He wasn't just a businessman. He was an architect of Gulf Coast progress, a man whose signature on a deal could reshape the local economic map. That evening, he stepped out of his imported sedan, his linen suit impeccably tailored against the tropical heat, and opened the door of the restaurant Lafayette's for his companion. Jessica Vaughan, at 28, was the embodiment of digital modernity, a model and influencer whose life was a curated stream of perfect moments for her millions of followers. She was the missing piece in Michael's public image puzzle, a gleaming trophy that affirmed his status. The interior of Lafayette's was an oasis of opulence amid the urban hustle. Crystal chandeliers, like captive constellations, spilled a soft golden light over tables adorned with exotic arrangements of magnolias, their velvety petals contrasting with the pristine white tablecloths. The murmur of discreet conversations and the clink of silver cutlery created a symphony of exclusivity. Jessica, draped in a red dress that seemed sewn onto her body, moved with the grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, her smile capturing and reflecting the admiration of other patrons. Michael, in turn, felt right at home. He greeted the maître by name, exchanged a nod with a judge at a nearby table, and settled into his reserved spot, a strategic point with a panoramic view of the dining room, but still offering an aura of privacy. Power, he knew, wasn't about flash. It was about the quiet certainty that everyone knew who you were. The French Quarter ambassador confirmed for next week's charity auction, Jessica commented, flipping through the menu with her perfectly manicured fingertips. My publicist said Vogue wants to do a feature on New Orleans' most influential couples. We'd be the cover, obviously. Michael nodded, a polished smile on his face, but his mind was already miles away, calculating the logistics of a new fleet of cargo vessels. Jessica's voice became a distant hum, part of his life's soundtrack, important for the overall composition, but rarely the main focus. It was in that moment of calculated distraction that a peripheral movement shattered his concentration. It wasn't a waiter or a guest, but a figure emerging from the kitchen's swinging door, moving with efficiency and purpose that made him look up. It was a woman. Her dark hair was tied in a simple, functional bun, revealing the elegant line of her neck. She wore the white chef's jacket of the kitchen brigade, spotless with a dark apron tied at her waist. She approached a table of foreign tourists who applauded her discreetly. She smiled, a contained but genuine smile, and thanked them in fluent English, explaining something about the reduction of remoulade in the dish they'd praised. Michael felt the air leave his lungs. The glass of water in his hand seemed to freeze. That face, he knew it better than his own. The prominent cheekbones, the almond-shaped eyes that could sparkle with intelligence or darken with deep sadness. It was Anna Mitchell, his ex-wife. The initial shock was like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of him and making the luxurious dining room spin for an instant. But the knockout blow came next, when she turned in profile to head back to the kitchen. Under the fabric of her uniform, there was no hiding it. The prominent curve, the unmistakable shape of life in gestation. Anna wasn't just there, working in the kitchen of a restaurant he frequented. She was pregnant. Visibly, undeniably, and very, very pregnant. Michael's world, so carefully built on control and predictability, cracked. The buzz of the restaurant vanished, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in his ears. Every detail of the scene etched itself into his mind with painful clarity. The way her hand instinctively rested on her belly for a fraction of a second, the sheen of sweat on her forehead under the warm lights, the dignity in her posture, even in a work uniform. That woman, who had left his life with a deafening silence, was there, just feet away, carrying a secret with the power to implode his universe. "Michael, are you listening?" Jessica's voice, now tinged with impatience, brought him back to reality. He blinked, forcing his facial muscles into what he hoped was a convincing smile. "Sorry, darling. Just thinking about the contract with the Texans. What were you saying about Vogue?" But his words were hollow, automatic. His eyes, against his will, kept seeking the kitchen door, waiting, fearing. Another glimpse of the woman he thought he'd left behind, and the future she carried within her. A future he had no idea if he was part of. The night, which had started like so many others, a display of his power and success, had turned into an abyss of uncertainties. And Michael Reynolds, the man who commanded rivers, felt himself drowning on dry land. The drive back to the penthouse in the Garden District was a silent blur. Jessica chattered excitedly about plans for a weekend at a bayou resort, about the colors she'd wear for the photo shoot. But her words were like raindrops on armored glass, unable to penetrate the storm brewing inside Michael. He drove on autopilot, his knuckles white on the leather steering wheel, every passing headlight feeling like a spotlight exposing him. The image of Anna, pregnant, overlaid the urban landscape of New Orleans, the dignity in her face, the subtle fatigue in her shoulders, the curve of her belly. Every detail was a needle pricking his conscience. Upon arriving at the building, he barely said goodbye to Jessica, muttering an excuse about a sudden headache so flimsy that even she, usually absorbed in her own world, arched an eyebrow in doubt. But he didn't care. He needed to be alone. The penthouse door closed behind him with a muffled click, and the silence of the vast, impersonal apartment swallowed him. It was a space designed to impress, with double-height ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the river's bend, and artworks by renowned local artists adorning the walls. But that night, the luxury felt cold, sterile. Michael walked to the bar, his steps echoing on the marble floor, and poured himself a generous shot of aged bourbon, the finest in his collection. The liquid burned going down, but it couldn't warm the ice that had settled in his chest. He stood there in the dark, the city glittering at his feet like a carpet of indifferent diamonds, and the same question hammered in his mind. Pregnant by whom? And why? Why there in that restaurant, as if fate was mocking him? Their divorce, finalized just 5 months ago, had been an anomaly in his world of aggressive negotiations and corporate battles. It was antiseptic, quick, almost surgical. No shouts, no accusations, no contentious division of assets like he saw happen with his peers. Anna simply agreed to everything. She sat across from him in the lawyer's conference room, her face serene, and signed the papers. Her only demand was the absence of demands. "I just want to move on, Michael," she'd said, her voice steady, without a hint of hesitation. At the time, he felt immense relief. The lack of drama was efficient, practical. It would allow him to focus entirely on expanding Reynolds Riverways, without the distractions of a marriage that, in his view, had become more an obligation than a partnership. He saw her as a simple woman, perhaps even naive, who didn't grasp the scale of his empire, and thus didn't know what she was missing. Now that memory haunted him. Her silence wasn't submission, it was a declaration of independence, an independence that now terrified him. Sleep was impossible. The image of her pregnant was a ghost that refused to be exorcised. By dawn, with the first rays painting the Mississippi in shades of orange and pink, Michael was already in his home office, his pale face illuminated by the laptop screen. Impatience was his nature, and uncertainty his enemy. He wouldn't wait for answers, he'd wrench them from reality. With a few calls to the right contacts, men who operated in the shadows able to uncover any secret for a price, he set a discreet investigation into Anna Mitchell's life in motion. He wanted to know everything: where she lived, who she saw, how she paid her bills, and above all, who was the father of that child. The results came faster than he expected, in an encrypted file that landed in his email less than 48 hours later. He opened it with trembling hands, his heart pounding unevenly. The report was detailed. The address in Algiers, a modest neighborhood light years from the luxury of the Garden District. The job as sous chef at Lafayette's, earned on merit after years in smaller kitchens. No mention of a new man, no serious relationship detected. But it was two attached documents that made Michael's ground vanish. The first was a copy of the divorce agreement, highlighting the clause where she waived any rights to his assets, a fortune that would set her up comfortably for life. Why? Why would someone give up millions out of pride? Michael's business logic couldn't process the variable, but it was the second attachment that broke him. Records from a fertility clinic, consultations, exams, procedures. The dates were from a year before the separation, a period when their marriage was already in ruins, sustained only by routine and convenience. Anna. His Anna, quiet and reserved, had been secretly trying to get pregnant. Alone. He racked his memory, searching for a sign, a conversation, anything that hinted at this deep desire. And then, like a punch, he remembered. A rare night they dined at home. He was talking about acquiring a competitor, about the need for total focus. And she, in a low voice, almost a whisper, asked, "You never think about having kids, Michael?" He remembered laughing, not maliciously, but with the incredulity of hearing an absurd question. "Kids? Now?" "Anna, that would be a disaster. The company needs me, 100%. There's no room for distractions." She never brought it up again. And he, in his arrogance, assumed she'd agreed, that she'd understood. He leaned back in his chair, the air heavy in his lungs. The revelation wasn't just information. It was a mirror reflecting the image of a man he didn't want to admit he was. A man so consumed by his own ambition that he became blind to the dreams of the woman who slept beside him. He hadn't just neglected her, he'd invalidated her. Her pregnancy wasn't an act of betrayal against him, he realized with devastating clarity. It was an act of her own survival, a cry for life that he'd tried to silence. The question was no longer, whose child is it? The question consuming him now was far deeper and more painful. How much of that loneliness, that desperate decision to seek motherhood alone, was his fault? The empire he'd built on the river's waters suddenly seemed like a sandcastle, and the tide of his own regret was rising, threatening to wash it all away. The revelation left him breathless, as if he'd plunged into the cold depths of the Mississippi. Michael Reynolds, the man who prided himself on anticipating market moves and reading adversaries' intentions at a negotiation table, had been completely blind to the universe existing within his own home. The discovery about the fertility clinic wasn't just a fact, it was a silent accusation. Every consultation date in the report was a knife twisting in his conscience, marking the days he was probably in a meeting, on a business trip, or simply at home, physically present but mentally thousands of miles away, immersed in spreadsheets and profit projections. The image of Anna undergoing invasive and emotionally draining medical procedures alone was torture. He who saw himself as a provider, a protector, had failed to provide what she wanted most and protected her from nothing, least of all the loneliness he'd imposed. The initial anger he'd felt upon seeing her in the restaurant dissipated, replaced by a more complex and uncomfortable emotion, shame. That shame, however, was potent fuel. Michael wasn't a man who drowned in self-pity. He was a man of action. Passivity was a luxury he didn't allow himself. If there was a problem, he confronted it. If there was a question, he demanded the answer. And the biggest question of all still hung in the air now with unbearable weight. He needed to hear it from her lips, needed to see it in her eyes. The smokescreen of his ignorance had lifted, and now he needed to face the fire. From that night on, Lafayette ceased to be a spot for social encounters and became his observation post. He became a regular, a constant and intrusive presence. He always chose the same table, the most discreet one in a dark corner of the dining room, from where he had a clear view of the kitchen door. He ordered the most expensive dish, the finest wine, but the food had no taste and the drink had no effect. His senses were focused on one thing, Anna's movements. He watched her with the intensity of a predator, noted how she moved with economical gestures, an efficiency forged by necessity, the weight of pregnancy evident in the way she discreetly leaned on counters when she thought no one was looking. He saw her interactions with the staff, the way a young kitchen assistant looked at her with admiration, how the head chef followed her instructions with respect. and he saw David Lawson, the restaurant manager. Michael had noticed him on the first night, but now he scrutinized him differently, tinged by a primal jealousy that surprised him. David was everything he wasn't: present, attentive, part of her world. He saw the way David approached Anna, always with a professional pretext, but with genuine concern in his eyes. He brought her a glass of water, insisted she take a break, his gaze lingering on her a second longer than strictly necessary. Each of those gestures was a small flame feeding the bonfire of Michael's distrust and insecurity. That man, with his well-tailored but not overly expensive suit and his air of quiet competence, represented a threat Michael didn't know how to combat. He couldn't buy him, couldn't intimidate him. David was in territory where Michael Reynolds' money and power meant nothing, the territory of affection and daily care. For days, Anna ignored him with a mastery that infuriated him. She felt his gaze burning into her back, a constant pressure that turned her already exhausting shift into an ordeal. She moved through the dining room, attending to other tables, overseeing the plating of dishes, but she created a force field around his table, a vacuum no waiter dared cross without a direct order. But Michael was patient when the prize was worth it. He waited. That night, he was the last customer to leave. He waited until the main dining room lights were dimmed, until the staff began setting tables for the next day. He saw her exit through the back door, her body bowed by exhaustion, and intercepted her in the dimly lit alley, the smell of garbage and recent rain in the air. The sound of his expensive shoes on the wet pavement made her stop and turn. The initial fear in her eyes was quickly replaced by defiant weariness. "What do you want, Michael?" she asked, her voice low but firm. He approached, closing the space between them, invading her protective aura. "I want to talk. Don't treat me like we're strangers, Anna." His eyes, deliberately, dropped to the prominence of her belly, visible even under the light coat she wore. The question hung in the humid air between them, laden with months of silence and years of distance. "This child, is it mine?" Anna straightened her shoulders, her hand instinctively protecting her abdomen. The gesture, so natural and protective, hit Michael with the force of a physical blow. "It doesn't matter anymore," she replied, her voice cutting. "My life and my child's life have nothing to do with yours." The firmness in her words contrasted with the slight tremor he noticed in her hands. She was scared but determined not to show it. "Nothing to do with me?" he retorted, his voice rising an octave, frustration breaking his facade of calm. "You disappear, I find you pregnant, and you tell me it has nothing to do with me? You tried to get pregnant while you were still my wife, Anna. I know about the clinic. I know everything." The confession caught him by surprise as much as her. Anna's face drained of color, the revelation that he'd investigated her life hitting her like a slap. "You had no right," she whispered, anger and violation shining in her eyes. Before the argument could escalate, the back door opened, spilling a strip of light into the alley. David appeared in the doorway, his face creased with concern. "Anna? Everything okay out here?" "I heard voices." His gaze shifted from Anna to Michael, and his posture changed instantly, becoming protective. He stepped forward, subtly placing himself between them. "Are you bothering one of my employees, sir?" The calm in David's voice was more threatening than any shout. Michael felt a wave of fury. Who was this man to interpose? "This is a private matter," Michael growled, "a matter between me and my ex-wife." The hesitation on wife didn't go unnoticed by David, whose gaze hardened further. "Right now, she's my sous chef, and she looks tired and upset. I advise you to leave her alone." Anna, sensing the tension about to explode, intervened. "It's fine, David, thanks. I'm heading out." She shot Michael a look that was a mix of contempt and plea. "Go away, Michael, please." The word please was the only thing that stopped him from advancing. He stepped back, his jaw clenched, his heart pounding against his ribs. He watched, powerless, as David escorted Anna to the corner, waiting until she got into a cab. Only then did the manager turn and look at Michael, a long, silent stare that was a clear declaration of war. That night, Michael didn't get the answer he wanted, but he found something new: a rival. And the battle for Anna, and the child she carried had just begun. The weeks following the alley confrontation turned into a Cold War, waged in the polished halls of Lafayette's and the streets of New Orleans. Michael, wounded in his pride and driven by an obsession he refused to name, intensified his campaign. He was no longer just a silent observer. He became a strategic presence, almost military. He showed up at the restaurant during peak hours, forcing Anna to a constant awareness of his presence. He sent extravagant gifts to her apartment in Algiers, cribs of fine oak, imported strollers, designer baby clothes that were systematically refused and returned. Each returned package was a slap, a reaffirmation of the wall she'd built around herself and her child. He tried to approach her, but David Lawson had become a protective shadow. The manager, with remarkable skill, seemed to anticipate Michael's every move, appearing at Anna's side with a plausible pretext, a question about the menu, an issue with the supplier, always creating an impenetrable human barrier. The rivalry between the two men was an underground electric current, invisible to most but palpable to those involved. It was a power struggle between the deposed king and the castle's guardian. For Anna, the pressure was unbearable. The kitchen work, once her refuge, her space of creation and pride, became a minefield. The heat from the stoves and ovens added to the heat of her anxiety. The weight of the baby in her womb seemed to grow each day, an anchor tying her to an increasingly complicated reality. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was a soul-deep fatigue. She felt like a cornered animal, hunted by an unrelenting predator who refused to give up. The nights were the worst. She lay in her bed, in the silence of her small apartment, and felt the baby move inside her. It was a miracle, her private miracle, but the joy always came with a wave of panic. How could she protect that little life from the whirlwind that was Michael Reynolds? She remembered the man she'd married, his overwhelming ambition that consumed all the oxygen around him, and feared he'd see their child not as a person, but as a possession, another asset for his empire. David was her only safe harbor, a friend whose kindness and concern were a balm for her wounds, but she knew she couldn't lean on him forever. This was her battle, and she'd have to win it alone. The night everything changed started like any other. A torrential rain poured over New Orleans, the sound of water pounding on the roof and windows creating a sonic curtain isolating the outside world. Anna had gotten home early, sent by David, who'd noticed her pallor and the way she leaned on counters more often. She sat on the couch, her body aching, and tried to relax, her hand resting on her belly. It was almost 2 months until the due date. But that night something was different. A sharp twinge, low and deep, made her catch her breath. She waited, her heart racing. It passed. Maybe it was just fatigue, stress. But minutes later the pain returned, stronger, wrapping her belly like an iron belt tightening mercilessly. A cold fear ran down her spine. It was too early. Way too early. She tried to stand to grab the phone, but another contraction hit, taking her breath and forcing her to double over, a moan escaping her lips. Across town, Michael was in the middle of one of the year's most important meetings. Seated at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by his executives and a delegation of foreign investors, he discoursed on growth projections, on conquering new river routes. He was in his element, the master of the universe, controlling the narrative, seducing the investors with his vision and unshakable confidence. His personal cell, normally silenced during such occasions, vibrated on the table. He ignored it. It vibrated again and again. Irritated by the interruption, he grabbed the device to turn it off, but the name on the screen stopped him. Mrs. Jenkins, Anna's neighbor. His heart leaped. He stood abruptly, cutting off his own sentence mid-word. "Excuse me, gentlemen. 1 minute." He walked to the window, his back to the confused room, and answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was shrill, laced with panic. "Mr. Michael? It's Jenkins, Anna's neighbor. For God's sake, come over here. The girl's in bad shape. She's in a lot of pain, writhing on the couch. She doesn't want me to call an ambulance, says it's too early, but she's white as a sheet. I didn't know who else to call. Your number was the only one in her emergency contacts." Every word was a hammer striking his chest. His number in her emergency contacts. Despite everything, Despite the anger, the pride, the distance, he was still the person to call in a crisis. The floor of his reality liquefied. The meeting, the investors, the logistics empire, all dissolved into insignificance. "I'm on my way," he said, his voice hoarse, and hung up. He turned to the table, the faces of his executives and investors staring at him in a mix of shock and confusion. "Gentlemen, the meeting is over, force majeure." Without further explanation, he strode across the room, grabbed his car keys, and ran to the elevator, leaving behind a trail of perplexity and potential millions. His driver waited at the door, but Michael waved him off. He'd drive himself. No one would be fast enough. He drove through New Orleans' flooded streets like a madman, rain lashing the windshield, tires screeching on the wet asphalt. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and regret. Too early. The neighbor's words echoed in his head. He remembered reading somewhere about the dangers of premature birth. Every red light he ran, every car he cut off, was a silent prayer. Upon arriving at the modest building in Algiers, he leaped from the car and bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, heart in his throat. The apartment door was open. He found her exactly as the neighbor described, curled on the couch, face pale and slick with sweat, breathing short and gasping. "Mrs." Jenkins was beside her, fanning her with a piece of cardboard, eyes wide with terror. Upon seeing Michael, relief flooded the woman's face. Anna lifted her eyes, and in them he saw a mix of pain, fear, and a vulnerability that disarmed him completely. "Michael," she whispered, his name a plea for help. There was no time for questions, accusations, anything. Instinct took over. "We're going to the hospital. Now," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. She tried to protest, murmuring something about it not being time, but another contraction silenced her, drawing a muffled cry. Michael didn't hesitate. In one motion, he scooped her up in his arms. She was heavier than he remembered, the solid weight of the child and her, but he barely felt it. Adrenaline consumed him. He carried her out of the apartment, down the stairs with a care that contrasted his urgent movements. He settled her in the passenger seat of his car, the luxurious leather seeming incongruent with the rawness of the situation. During the drive to City General Hospital, the nearest with a good neonatal unit, she clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin with each new wave of pain. "It's too early, Michael," she repeated, her voice choked with panic. "What if something happens to him?" And for the first time, he found the right words. He covered her hand with his, eyes fixed on the rain-soaked road. "Nothing's going to happen," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, a rock of certainty amid the chaos. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." And in those words, a promise was made. A promise he didn't know if he could keep, but one he'd do anything to honor. The man who lived by controlling uncertain futures now faced the most terrifying uncertainty of his life, and all he could do was be present. The lights of City General Hospital blurred fluorescently overhead. The smell of antiseptic and the contained urgency in the hallways created a bubble of raw reality, far from the marble halls and air-conditioned boardrooms of Michael's world. He'd never felt so powerless. His name, which opened doors and silenced objections, meant nothing here. He was just the companion, a scared man in an expensive, rumpled suit, pushing Anna's gurney alongside the nurses. Every moan from her was a twist in his gut. He held her hand an anchor in the storm and felt the surprising strength with which she squeezed his at each contraction. In that grip there was pain, fear, but also a fierce determination that haunted him. That was the strength he'd never seen or refused to see. When they took her to the delivery room, a nurse tried to bar him. "Medical staff only, sir." Michael, for the first time in years, didn't use his authority or commanding tone. He looked at Anna, her face contorted in pain, her eyes pleading fixed on his. Then he turned to the nurse and his voice came out almost as a plea. "I'm the father. I'm not leaving her side." Maybe it was the conviction in his voice, or the desperation in his eyes, but the nurse hesitated and with a nod let him pass. The delivery room was a universe of stainless steel, beeping monitors in a frantic rhythm and palpable tension. Michael felt like an intruder, a spectator in a sacred and terrifying ritual, but he forced himself to focus on Anna. He positioned himself by her head, wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of his hand, and began whispering. They weren't planned words, but fragments of encouragement sprouting from a place he didn't know existed within him. "You can do this, Anna. You're strong. Breathe. I'm here, right here with you." The hours dragged, each minute an eternity. He saw her superhuman strength, the effort transforming her body, the primal battle for life. He saw pain in its purest form, stripped of any artifice, and felt overwhelming admiration. His whole life of business conquests, million-dollar deals, and power seemed insignificant, cowardly compared to what she was doing in that moment. The ice wall he'd built around his heart, brick by brick over the years, began to crack. And then, amid the chaos of beeps and medical orders, a sound tore through the air. A cry. Weak at first, then gaining strength. A high-pitched, angry, unmistakably alive cry, the most terrifying and beautiful sound Michael had ever heard. Anna's body relaxed on the bed, and a sob of pure relief and exhaustion escaped her lips. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with sweat. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, his voice calm amid the commotion. Small, but strong. A fighter. Michael felt a knot form in his throat, so tight it hurt. He looked at the tiny creature the doctor held, red, wrinkled, but perfect. His lungs filled with air, and he only realized he'd been holding his breath when he released it in a shaky sigh. When the nurse, after initial care, placed the baby wrapped in a blanket in Anna's arms, the world stopped. The way she looked at her son, a gaze of absolute, unconditional adoration, shattered Michael's last defenses. He approached, hesitant. Anna lifted her eyes to him, and in them there was no anger, no resentment, just deep weariness and something more, something he didn't dare name. "He's beautiful, isn't he?" she whispered. Michael looked at the small face, eyes still closed, tiny mouth moving. He extended his hand, his finger touching the baby's soft cheek. In that touch, a universe of possibilities opened. "Ethan," Anna said, her voice choked. "His name is Ethan." Michael repeated the name in a whisper, testing the sound on his tongue. Ethan, his son. The word echoed at his core, rearranging everything. The following weeks were a brutal and necessary re-education. Ethan, being premature, needed to stay in the neonatal intensive care unit. That sterile environment, full of incubators and monitors, became Michael's new universe center. He learned a new vocabulary: oxygen saturation, weight gain, sucking reflex. He saw Anna spend hours by the incubator, whispering to her son, touching him through the ports, a ritual of love and hope. And, to everyone's surprise, especially his own, Michael was there. He cancelled meetings, delegated decisions he'd once considered vital. Reynolds Riverways, the center of his existence, became secondary. He arrived at the hospital before dawn, often finding Anna already there, and stayed until late at night. They didn't talk much at first. The silence between them was filled by the constant beeps of machines and their son's fragile presence. But it was a different silence, no longer laden with resentment, but with shared worry, a truce forced by Ethan's vulnerability. Michael began to observe Anna in a new way. He saw her resilience, the way she handled the doctors, asking intelligent questions and absorbing every bit of information. He saw the tenderness with which she held her son during kangaroo care, his skin against hers. And he saw the deep exhaustion under her eyes, the fragility of her body recovering from birth. Driven by a newfound protective instinct, he began to care for her. He brought food from Lafayette's, knowing she barely ate the hospital fare. He hired a nurse to help her at home when she was finally discharged. Before Ethan, he handled all the hospital bureaucracy, using his influence not to intimidate, but to facilitate, to ensure Anna and Ethan had the best of everything. They were gestures, not words, actions that spoke louder than any apology he could formulate. Anna, in turn, watched these changes with caution, bordering on distrust. Was this the real Michael, or just a temporary version, motivated by guilt and shock? She remembered the countless nights waiting for him, cold dinners, broken promises, the crushing loneliness in a luxury penthouse. The scars were too deep to heal with a few weeks of good behavior. She accepted his help, not for herself, but for Ethan. She saw the genuine effort in his eyes when he tried, awkwardly, to learn from the nurses how to hold the baby, check his temperature. There was a humility in him she'd never seen. But trust, once shattered into so many pieces, doesn't rebuild easily. David's presence during this period complicated things further. He called Anna every day, visited her at the hospital whenever he could, bringing not expensive gifts but his time, his listening ear, a hot coffee. David's calm, constant presence was a stark counterpoint to Michael's newfound intensity. And, inevitably, the two men crossed paths in the hospital corridors. The encounters were tense, loaded with thinly veiled hostility. Michael saw in David the ghost of the man he should have been for Anna. David saw in Michael the arrogant power that had hurt the woman he clearly harbored deep feelings for. For Michael, each of David's visits was a reminder that he wasn't the only man in Anna's life, that his path back to her wasn't clear. Insecurity, an emotion he barely knew, gnawed at his insides, making his determination to prove his worth even fiercer. He wasn't just fighting to be a father, he was fighting to reclaim ground he didn't even know he'd lost. The day Ethan was finally discharged was a milestone. Michael prepared Anna's apartment, ensuring everything was perfect. When he drove her home, with the small and fragile Ethan secure in his car seat, the feeling of entering that simple space was more significant than closing any deal in his life. That first night, Ethan wouldn't stop crying. Anna, exhausted, no longer knew what to do. Michael, who'd kept a respectful distance until then, approached. "Let me try," he said softly. With a gentleness that surprised them both, he took his son in his arms. He rocked him, pacing the small apartment, humming an off-key melody his own mother had sung to him. And, as if by miracle, Ethan calmed, his tiny body relaxing against his father's chest. Anna watched the scene from the bedroom door, her heart torn between hope and fear. The man holding her son was the same one who'd broken her heart. Was the change real, or just the prelude to a new storm? She didn't know the answer, but for the first time a small part of her wanted to believe it was. The return home wasn't a return to normalcy, but the start of a new and fragile reality. The small apartment in Algiers, once Anna's sanctuary of peace, transformed into an epicenter of sleepless nights, piercing cries, and a relentless routine dictated by a newborn's needs. And to Anna's surprise, Michael inserted himself into that chaos not as a visitor, but as a reluctantly accepted cohabitant. He didn't go back to his penthouse in the Garden District. Using the excuse that he needed to be close in case of an emergency, he started sleeping on the living room couch, a giant out of place in an environment not made for him. The couch was too small, the street noise woke him, but he didn't complain. On the contrary, he seemed to embrace the discomfort as a form of penance. The wee hours became the main stage for this silent transformation. When Ethan woke crying, Michael was often the first to get up. Anna, exhausted in her bed, heard his footsteps in the dark, the whisper of his deep voice trying to soothe the baby, the clumsy but determined sound of a diaper being changed. She watched him from the door crack, a spy in her own home. Saw him warm the bottle with concentration he'd once devoted to international contracts. Saw him pace the room with Ethan in his arms, his profile, once always tense and business-focused, now softened by the moonlight streaming through the window, eyes fixed on the tiny being in his arms. There was reverence in his gestures, a surrender she'd never thought possible in him. He was learning the language of care, a foreign tongue he struggled to master, stumbling over the words, but with undeniable sincerity in his pronunciation. During the day, the dynamic was different. Michael's presence was a force of nature reorganizing the space. He took over the shopping, filling the fridge with healthy foods for Anna. He hired a cleaner to help with housekeeping, freeing up her time. He scheduled and accompanied her to every pediatric appointment, listening intently to the doctor's instructions, taking notes on his smartphone as if in a board meeting. But Anna kept her guard up. She was grateful for the help, couldn't deny the relief she felt, but the forced intimacy of the situation was a minefield. They moved through the house like two planets in a strange orbit, sometimes drawing near in moments of caring for Ethan, other times retreating to their corners of silence, the weight of the past between them as tangible as the furniture in the room. David remained a constant presence, though at a distance. He called, texted, offered help. Each call was a small test for Michael, who heard David's name on Anna's lips with a clench of his jaw. He said nothing, but insecurity sparked in his eyes, a reminder that her forgiveness and perhaps her heart were still contested territories. The turning point wasn't a grand gesture, but a moment of raw vulnerability. On a particularly tough afternoon, Ethan had colic, his incessant high-pitched cry echoing through the apartment and Anna's nerves. She'd tried everything, and desperation took hold. Tears of frustration and exhaustion rolled down her face as she rocked her son, who seemed inconsolable. Michael, watching from the door, entered the room, took Ethan from her arms, and simply said, "Go take a shower. Rest. I'll handle him." Anna hesitated, but fatigue won. She locked herself in the bathroom and, to the sound of the cry starting to fade, broke down in sobs herself, releasing months of tension, fear, and loneliness. When she emerged, the apartment was silent. She found Michael in the armchair, Ethan sleeping soundly on his chest. The late afternoon light streamed through the window, creating a halo around them. Michael lifted his eyes to her, and for the first time, she didn't see the businessman, the tycoon, the ex-husband. She saw a weary, vulnerable man, and in his eyes an apology deeper than any words. In that silence, a small crack appeared in Anna's wall. Weeks later, when Ethan was stronger, Michael made an unexpected invitation. "Let's get out a bit, see the river." He took her not to one of his luxury yachts, but to a simple wooden dock on the Mississippi's edge, a spot frequented by locals. The afternoon sun painted the sky, and the river's waters in fiery tones. As Anna sat on a bench feeling the breeze on her face, Michael walked along the dock's edge with Ethan in a sling, the baby secure against his chest. He pointed out passing vessels, explaining the differences, not with the owner's arrogance but with the affection of someone who loved what he did. Anna watched him, and the image was so powerful, so dissonant from everything she knew of him, that her heart ached. The man who saw the river as a series of trade routes was now showing it to his son like a poem in motion. He stopped in front of her, his gaze serious, voice low so as not to wake the baby. "I know I messed up, Anna. I know I was blind, selfish. I built an empire but almost lost what really mattered. And I'm not just talking about Ethan." He took a deep breath, vulnerability exposed on his face. "I don't want to be just your child's father, a functional co-parent you share responsibilities with. I want to win you back. I want the chance to be the man I should have been from the start." The words hung in the air, mingling with the soft lapping of water on wood. Anna looked at Ethan's sleeping face, so serene, then at Michael's eyes awaiting her verdict. The anger, the hurt were still there, but beneath them, something new began to sprout. "Change takes time, Michael," she said finally, her voice firm but without the previous hardness. "Words are easy. If you really want this, you'll have to prove it. Not for a week, not for a month. You'll have to prove it every day, with every action." He didn't argue, didn't try to negotiate. He just nodded, a slow, grave nod. "Every day," he repeated, like a vow. For the first time, he wasn't trying to control the outcome. He was accepting the process. He knew the road to regaining her trust would be long and steep, full of past ghosts and rivals like David's shadow. But as he looked at Anna and the sun sleeping on his chest under New Orleans' spectacular sky, Michael Reynolds knew, with a certainty he'd never felt closing a deal, that he was finally on the right path. He was no longer just the king of the river. He was learning to be his family's safe harbor, and that journey he knew was worth more than any empire. What a story, huh? If you, like me, got emotional, got angry, and rooted for this couple, make some noise in the comments. I really want to hear your opinions. What did you think of Michael's transformation? Should Anna give him another chance? And what score from 0 to 10 do you give this story? Your opinions are our thermometer. And if you love stories that hook you from start to finish, that make you feel a whirlwind of emotions, then you're in the right place. Join our community, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any of the upcoming narratives we're preparing with all the care. See you in the next video.